Writing has given me an escape that I feel like is okay, especially when it comes to emoting and showing our emotions. My life, if I couldn't write, would be a lot different. When you're with that pen and paper, no one can tell you you're right, nobody can tell you you're wrong, and that is beautiful. I am Berma. I am a poet from Toronto's East End. My cultural background is from Nepal. I represent that all day. Growing up in Scarborough influences everything that you do. From my mannerisms to the way that I talk to the friends that I still have to this day. It was definitely such a big influence for me growing up, and it is something that I carried in my writing. Forensics will call art majors and hipsters to discuss the tan-going tones like good grief. The blue was so deep. The green and red live in harmony like Christmas Day. He was an artist until the day that he died. Some days, I dress up my words in a padded room of poetry to make my ugly sins look beautiful, but in fact, I'm the ugliest boy that has ever lived. I'm from Nepal, and I'm also a first-generation immigrant, and it could be kind of confusing being an artist and being a first-generation immigrant because your parents come to this land and they want you to succeed. They want you to pursue that typical career of doctor, engineer, or rocket scientist, whatever it may be, and that's sort of not the approach that I took. I was more outside the box, and I loved art, and it's confusing for them because they'll constantly ask me like, hey, I know you're doing well in this art community, but what are you doing in school? How are you doing in school? What's your plan beyond this art? And so it's always hard for me to explain to them that my art is also helping my community and what I'm doing in school because they're so intertwined when I work in these communities. I've always been performing. Growing up in like a Nepali community, we're really tight-knit. So every time there was a cultural celebration, my parents would force me to like go up there and dance. So I got rid of that stage fright fairly quickly. But I remember the first time performing a poem was actually in front of my high school. And it was with this after-school program, and they threw us up at the beginning of an assembly to do a poem, and I was shaking. Like, I'm usually pretty good in front of crowds, but I started to realize that there was no more hiding. There was no more facades. There was no more me being able to slither my way through a situation. No, this was my words. This was my true, deepest thoughts. And I was scared, but as soon as I got off stage, and I'm sure the poem was awful, but as soon as I got off stage, people were shaking my hand, they were congratulating me, and they were saying things like, hey, like that's an emotion that I felt. And I'm so glad you said it because I've never been able to say that. Moments like that still happen to me are moments that make me realize that what I'm doing is important and it's a message that needs to be out there. So I'm always grateful for that, and that is a feeling that has kept me going from my first performance to my whatever number I'm on now. I originally did not like poetry whatsoever. I thought it was weird. I thought it was somebody on stage yelling at me, and I did not like it as an angsty teenager. But I was in my own right writing little raps and writing little love poems to whoever I was crushing on at the time, and I started to realize that it was an expression for a lot of people. And when I started to get introduced to professionals and start to see that it wasn't just somebody yelling at me, it was actual art and it was an actual expression, and I started trying it, I was addicted. I will only show you the traits that remind you of my strength. Maybe it's a splash of toxic masculinity, but it fits me just right. Like forest green hanging off of my limbs when the scythe comes from my family tree. I'll play the same black and white movie every single time, back of the bus, staring out of the window, listening to music. This will be the soundtrack to my protagonist's monologue, or maybe it'll be less cinematic. Toronto aids in your growth as a writer because of the diversity that you face when you grow up. The way that we walk, the way that we talk, the music that we listen to. If you listen to any Toronto artist, you can easily see the influence of Jamaica and the islands and what that has to do with our everyday life. So growing up, we face all these new cultures and we learn, and it makes us more versatile in our ability to know about the world. And we become metropolitan because we have to interact on a daily basis with new people. So it gives you new experiences, and that just increases your ability to write about different things. So words that have influenced me growing up in this multicultural community have always been words like still, which is like a very Toronto-centric thing. And I feel like in my writing, it more comes from the things that I can't attain in my everyday life. The things that I am so caught up in that aren't necessarily the culture that surrounds me. So for me, it's birds. I talk about birds a lot. I use a lot of colors, and I talk about mental health a lot. All three things that are very interesting because it's not often talked about in my neighborhood. But as soon as I come off of stage, that is when you can see the Scarborough in me. Or when I'm talking on stage, that is when you can see the Scarborough in me, because it's important, because this is the culture that raised me. So I always have to pay homage to it. So whenever I go out of town to wherever it may be, whether I'm in Atlanta, New York, Chicago, wherever I'm at, I always try my hardest to never change how I speak, because it's important that it reflects where I come from. So for all the new writers or people who are afraid to start writing, the best words that I could give to you is just be yourself. I grew up in a community where even if you were right, you were wrong sometimes, and it's hard to face that because it checks your ego, and you have to check your ego at the door. But that intimacy of actually knowing yourself, that's a really Toronto phrase, to know yourself. And I feel like that is super important when it comes to writing, because if you are fake, when you get on that stage or when people read what you're writing, people can tell that you're being ingenuine. So it's always important to be yourself and know yourself and love yourself. That's the best things that I can offer. My city is filled with villains, cold hearts, and heavy lungs. The winter is a reminder that all of us are just chain smokers. The sight of your own breath will remind you that you have soul. The darkness will hide what you see, but can never hide how you feel. The streetlights will be your guide home. Banding together, intersections and stop signs, laces tied around a telephone wire with sneakers hanging like bodies, swaying in the wind like counting the seconds with a grandfather clock. This is where we grew up. Step out of your house, into your home. These streets raised us. Parents never understood how we found salvation in cement, like the rose that grew from concrete. We pour liquor into the soil of the roses that have lost their petals. Our city is confusing. They crowned us all stars, but have no idea how this galaxy works. We are a black hole, destroying ourselves before you can even find us. My city is a phenomenon. Winter is where everything goes to die. The leaves start to fall, and the tulips start to bend, and the animals go to hide. Even the sun tries to avoid us by setting early. I guess that's why I've always favored the moon. But in our city, we wear facades like fashion statements. We stand with our family, but we feel so alone. My city has straight face, but still wears a bluff close to its heart. Some of us with cold hearts because we're still recovering from an ice storm. When it sounds like cars with bass booming sound like war elephants coming down your street, I guess we're at war in our city. We wear our neighborhoods like gold stars beside our name. It's a badge of honor on the map. Malls marked with capital stars. I guess we are at war in our city. Dundas Square lights up a new Gotham. When the clock strikes 12, there's no dark night, so the monsters start to roam. My city is confused. Owls plastered everywhere. I guess my city is nocturnal. It's easy to get lost here. So on days where you are lost, leave a trail of breadcrumbs and remember where you come from, and stop to smell the rose with the kaleidoscopic petals and welcome yourself to our city.